Ben Shapiro needed merely 4 minutes and 17 seconds to make Ilhan Omar rue the moment she agreed to a forum valuing hard data over narratives of victimization. The highly anticipated CNN broadcast had been promoted for weeks as a defining glimpse into America's future, featuring a policy-centered clash that promised premium television viewing. It pitted Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, famous for his rapid-fire dismantling of arguments against Representative Ilhan Omar, the progressive lawmaker renowned for her emotive rhetoric and focus on identity politics. CNN executives had anticipated a polite exchange of differing viewpoints and perhaps a few shareable clips that would appease viewers across the political spectrum. Instead, what transpired was a rhetorical slaughter, a methodical and systematic deconstruction based on evidence that left Omar's talking points shattered and her political standing in grave peril. Omar entered the arena with the self-assurance of a politician who had spent years shielded by a compliant press and insulated from rigorous interrogation by the progressive machinery. She had encountered difficult inquiries in the past, but had always successfully deflected them by alleging racism or Islamophobia and pivoting to her status as a victim. Her strategy was prepared, centering on lived experiences and the plight of marginalized groups, while emphasizing the necessity of empathy over empirical proof. Shapiro conversely arrived on stage equipped with a laptop and a pile of dossiers, wearing the faint smirk of a man about to school someone who direly requires instruction. He sported his trademark yarmulke, serving as a visual signal that her attacks on Jews and Israel targeted a community capable of responding with both personal resonance and crushing factual accuracy. The moderator, Jake Tapper, appeared visibly anxious, and his apprehension was justified as the two participants delivered their introductory remarks. Omar spoke with fervor regarding her refugee background, her role representing disenfranchised populations, and her commitment to battling for equity and justice. It was an effective speech rehearsed to be emotive and engineered to pull at heartstrings while asserting her moral high ground. Shapiro then took his turn, thanking the Congresswoman for her moving opening, but immediately pivoting to the argument that personal stories do not constitute factual evidence. He asserted that lived experience is not a substitute for proof, that emotions do not override data, and that feeling offended does not equate to being correct. He proposed they examine her actual track record, noting he had spent weeks analyzing her voting history, financial disclosures, public statements, and policy stances. Shapiro warned he had numerous questions and intended to speak rapidly because he had substantial ground to cover and she had a significant amount of explaining to do. The audience grew restless as Omar's smile began to fade, while Tapper looked as if he was already second-guessing his decision to moderate. The ensuing events became the most viewed political debate of the decade, not due to its competitiveness, but because it was a total annihilation supported by years of accumulated receipts. Shapiro bypassed pleasantries entirely, bringing up a timeline on the background screen and launching into a prosecutorial indictment delivered with the cadence of an auctioneer. He announced they would begin with her marriages, noting the plural because the saga was more convoluted than a complex film plot and less plausible than fiction. In 2002, she entered a religious marriage with Ahmed Abdi Salan Hersi, which was not legally recognized by the state, though she publicly referred to him as her husband. While admitting they had children together and lived the American dream, Shapiro began gesturing frantically at the timeline displayed on the monitor. He pointed out that in 2009 she legally married Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, a situation that became statistically impossible to explain as an innocent occurrence. Mr. Elmi had entered the United States on a student visa just weeks before marrying her, which raises immediate suspicion since wedding, a citizen is the fastest route to residency. Shapiro continued over her attempted interruption, noting that after marrying Elmi, she lived at a completely different address from him, while her children's school records listed Elmi's address as their home. At the same time, she maintained joint bank accounts with Elmi despite living separately and actually residing with Mr. Hersey during this period. He clicked to the next slide, revealing that in 2014 and 2015, while still legally married to Elmi, she filed joint tax returns with Mr. Hersey. Shapiro declared this was not a gray area, but rather tax fraud because filing jointly with someone one is not married to, while married to another, is illegal. Each return she signed carried a penalty of perjury, meaning she had signed at least 2 fraudulent documents constituting 2 separate felony counts. Shapiro displayed a series of immigration documents on the large screen with the blue light of the data reflecting clearly in his glasses. He noted that she divorced Elmi in 2017 and legally married Hersey in 2018, the very man she had been living with and filing fraudulent taxes with previously. This sequence of events led to serious public inquiries regarding whether Elmi was actually her brother, as had been widely alleged and documented by investigators. She had repeatedly refused to submit to a DNA test that would definitively disprove these allegations, leading him to ask why she wouldn't simply take the test to end the rumors. Shapiro turned to face her, directly leaning into the podium to explain the statistical reality of the situation to the audience. He argued that the probability of this entire pattern, including the visa timing, addresses, tax returns, and bank accounts being a coincidence, was approximately 0.1%. He noted he was being generous with that estimate, suggesting she would have better odds of winning the lottery, while simultaneously being struck by lightning. Shapiro insisted these were not merely personal errors, but rather a distinct pattern of calculated deception designed to circumvent the law. Omar's face flushed visibly as she gripped her lectern, countering that these were racist conspiracy theories pushed by right-wing extremists to delegitimize her. Shapiro immediately cut her off, stating that facts and documents are not racist, and neither are her own signatures on federal forms. He continued by asserting that mathematics is not racist, and bank records showing joint accounts with a man she did not live with are simply records. Immigration documents establishing a visa timeline are government files, not acts of bigotry, and tax returns proving she filed jointly with Hersey while married to Elmi are evidence of crimes. Leaning forward and speaking at a blistering pace, he declared that the only racism present was the assumption she should be exempt from the law due to her identity. He referenced the phrase "equal justice under law" carved into the Supreme Court, reminding her that everyone must answer for their conduct equally. Shapiro told her she was not special or a victim, but a public official who needed to explain why her records suggested a trifecta of immigration fraud, tax fraud, and perjury. Omar attempted to regain her balance, claiming the allegations about her brother had been thoroughly debunked by multiple outlets. Shapiro shot back, asking by whom, noting it was certainly not debunked by a DNA test or by her providing any documentation to disprove the familial link. He pointed out she had offered no explanation for the separate addresses or false tax returns, effectively declaring the matter debunked, while refusing to provide evidence. Shapiro explained that one cannot simply say the word debunked and expect physical evidence to vanish, because that is not how proof functions. He listed what was known for certain, including the marriage timeline, the separate living arrangements, the joint accounts, and the false tax filings. He presented a binary choice, asking if she was the unluckiest person in history with a suspicious pattern of behavior or if she committed fraud. The room fell into a heavy silence as Omar looked to Tapper for assistance, but the moderator stared at his notes, finding no escape route. Shapiro offered no time for recovery, pulling up a massive spreadsheet on the screen filled with columns of numbers that widened the audience's eyes. He introduced the topic of her daughter's consulting firm, correcting himself to call it a family money laundering operation disguised as a business. He pointed to the spreadsheet, explaining this was data from Federal Election Commission filings showing her campaign paid the E Street Group $2.7 million between 2018 and 2020. The E Street Group is run by Tim Minott, who is now her husband, and Shapiro proceeded to establish the market rates for the services provided. He noted that after calling 10 political consulting firms, the market rate for such services was approximately $5,000 to $10,000 per cycle. Her campaign, however, paid between $75,000 and $150,000 per cycle, which he calculated was 15 times the standard market rate. Calculating on the screen, he showed that while the market value was around $300,000, the amount actually paid was $2.7 million, resulting in an excess of $2.4 million. Shapiro argued this was not a rounding error or a premium for quality, but rather the conversion of campaign funds into personal family income. He pulled up comparison data showing that other members of Congress in similar districts paid an average of $180,000 for comparable services over the same period. Since she paid $2.7 million, or 15 times, what her colleagues paid, the only variable justifying the premium was the personal connection. Shapiro clicked through more data, noting the first payment occurred in April 2018, followed by photos of her and Mr. Minott together in June. By October 2019, payments to the E Street Group exploded to over $600,000 in just 6 months before she eventually married Mr. Minott in November 2020. He looked at her with mock curiosity, noting payments started with the relationship increased as it developed and resulted in millions paid above market rates. Shapiro asserted this was not consulting, but campaign fund conversion to personal benefit, utilizing a romantic relationship to bypass ethical standards. He pulled up FEC complaint documentation, noting that while there are rules against personal use of funds, overpaying a partner is functionally the same thing. Summarizing the math, he stated that the $2.4 million overpayment was effectively donor money converted to personal benefit through her relationship with Mr. Minott. When Omar claimed the FEC reviewed the payments, Shapiro interrupted to clarify they approved the payments, not the rate, which was 15 times higher than normal. He argued she exploited a loophole because, while the action might be technically legal, it was unethical and enriched someone personally connected to her. He displayed donor lists containing the names of everyday workers who gave small amounts, believing she would fight for them. Instead, she transferred $2.4 million in excess payments to her romantic partner's company, which he called exploiting working people rather than fighting for them. Shapiro emphasized that if a Republican had done this, she would call for prosecution, but she viewed her own corruption as acceptable. He declared it was quantifiable, mathematical, and provable corruption, and the voters deserved to know she was enriching her family with their donations. Shapiro's expression became noticeably colder as he announced they would move to his favorite topic, her views on Jews and Israel. As a Jewish man who is pro-Israel, he noted he tends to notice when someone spends years proving they are anti-Semitic. He proposed reviewing her greatest hits chronologically to see the pattern of bigotry develop, pulling up a series of tweet archives on the screens. He highlighted a 2012 tweet where she claimed Israel had hypnotized the world, invoking a classical anti-Semitic trope about Jewish mind control. Shapiro explained that this idea of Jews secretly controlling world events through manipulation goes back centuries, and she applied it to the only Jewish state. Before she could respond, he clicked to a 2019 tweet where she claimed support for Israel was all about the money. He identified this as another classic trope of Jews using money to control politics, noting her apology at the time was insincere because she knew it was offensive. Shapiro pulled up more statements showing she compared Israel to the Taliban and terrorist organizations while never using such language for China or Iran. He pointed out she reserved her harshest rhetoric for the Jewish state, while ignoring actual concentration camps and execution of gay people elsewhere. Shapiro then displayed her voting record, showing she voted against funding the Iron Dome, a purely defensive system that saves civilian lives. He asked what possible reason she could have for opposing a system that shoots down rockets unless she did not want those specific civilians to live. He noted she voted against resolutions condemning the BDS movement and opposed designating groups that target Jews as terrorist organizations. Shapiro displayed data from the Anti-Defamation League showing that anti-Semitic incidents spiked by 23% in the 2 weeks following her controversial tweets. He told her directly that her rhetoric correlates with increases in attacks and that her words embolden those who commit violence against Jewish Americans. He summarized her actions as invoking mind control myths, minimizing terrorism, and comparing the Jewish state to the Taliban, while hiding behind policy criticism. Shapiro stated he criticizes the Israeli government frequently, but does so without using language from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. He distinguished between legitimate policy criticism and anti-Semitism, noting that one does not need to invoke ancient tropes to disagree with a government. Omar tried to interrupt, claiming her right to criticize, but Shapiro shouted that claiming Jews hypnotize the world is blood libel, not policy analysis. He argued that saying politics is all about the money invokes the myth of Jewish financial control, and comparing a democracy to the Taliban is an obsession. He asserted that although her party leadership rebuked her, she never changed her views, but simply became more careful with her phrasing. Shapiro grimly stated that her words, votes, and selective outrage prove she has a fundamental problem with Jews. The next round was designed to question her loyalty to the country that gave her refuge as Shapiro began discussing her oath of office. He read the text, noting she swore to defend the Constitution of the United States and pointed out it does not mention supporting Somalia. He clicked play on an audio file where she told a Somali community group that she was Somali first, Muslim second, and American third. Shapiro paused the recording to emphasize that those were her own words, placing her obligation to the U.S. Constitution in a distant third place. He pulled up voting records to match her words, showing that in every vote involving the Horn of Africa, she sided with Somalia. Whether the issue was Ethiopia, Kenya, or counterterrorism efforts, she consistently sided with Somalia against critical U.S. allies and interests. When the State Department recommended sanctions on corrupt Somali officials, she opposed them, and she consistently voted against designating al-Shabaab as terrorists. Shapiro revealed meeting records showing she met with Somali officials before U.S. delegations arrived, advocating for positions aligned with their government. He asked how she knew exactly what to advocate for unless she was being briefed by a foreign government, which suggests a conflict of interest. He shifted to campaign finance, showing significant donations from individuals connected to the Somali government flowing into her campaign. Shapiro confronted her with the reality that when U.S. interests conflict with Somali interests, her vote statements and advocacy always prioritize Somalia. He accused her of acting as a representative for a foreign government rather than representing her constituents, who are Americans, regardless of ancestry. When Omar claimed she represented Somali Americans, Shapiro retorted that they are Americans, and one cannot split loyalty after taking an oath. He reminded her that America gave her safety, education, and opportunity when Somalia could not, and she repaid that by ranking America third. He pointed to the data stating that prioritizing a foreign nation over her oath of office is a betrayal of the trust placed in her. Shapiro's face turned grim as he approached the confrontation over her most offensive statement regarding the attacks of September 11th. He described the day as the worst terrorist attack in American history, seared into memory with nearly 3,000 murdered and towers collapsing. He played a video clip of her speaking at a care event, where she described the attack by saying, "Some people did something." Shapiro paused the video to analyze the phrase, noting she described 19 al-Qaeda terrorists simply as some people, as if they were random. He displayed a comparison of how she described other tragedies, like the Christchurch shooting, which she specifically called terrorism rooted in white supremacy. He noted she used specific detailed language for the El Paso shooting and George Floyd, but used vague, passive language for the worst attack in U.S. history. He pointed out that she refused to name the 19 jihadists or mention the hijacked planes, reducing mass murder to merely something. Shapiro shared statements from first responders who felt her comment minimized their sacrifice and felt like being stabbed all over again. He displayed letters from 9/11 families, including a widow who was horrified that her husband's murder on live television was described so casually. He accused her of failing to honor the victims by naming the evil and instead minimizing the atrocity at an event for an organization with terror links. Shapiro raised his voice, noting she chose to speak at an event for CARE, an unindicted co-conspirator in a terrorism financing trial. He argued that describing white supremacist attacks with specificity, but using vague language for Muslim terrorists, reveals a political motivation. He claimed she minimizes mass murder because naming the ideology would complicate her politics, pivoting immediately to Muslim victimhood. Shapiro stated that her takeaway that civil liberties were lost while families were still grieving was not empathy, but moral bankruptcy. He then shifted gears from moral questions to intellectual ones, signaling he was about to test her understanding of economics. He began a quiz on basic economics, noting she makes policy for millions despite apparently not understanding how a balance sheet functions. Citing her celebration of killing the Amazon HQ2 deal in New York, he asked her to define exactly what a tax incentive is. When she stumbled, Shapiro cut her off to explain that the government does not give money in a tax incentive, but rather collects less future revenue. He pulled up a diagram showing that if a company does not come, the tax revenue is zero, whereas with incentives, the government gets some revenue. He noted the deal would have brought up to 40,000 jobs and $27 billion in tax revenue over time, proving her math was fundamentally flawed. Shapiro calculated on the whiteboard that the income tax revenue alone from the high-paying jobs would have been $4 billion. He explained that New York agreed to forego $3 billion to gain $4 billion in income taxes, plus billions more in other revenues. He argued that by claiming she saved $3 billion, she actually cost the city $8 billion in potential revenue. He accused her of setting potential billions on fire because she did not understand the difference between not collecting future money and spending current funds. Shapiro noted she killed 25,000 middle-class jobs because she mistakenly thought a tax incentive was a check written to Jeff Bezos. He moved to discuss her actual policy proposals, promising to present them with real arithmetic, and asking her to defend the math. Shapiro clicked through slides, noting the estimated cost of Medicare for all is $32 trillion over 10 years. Since total federal revenue is only $45 trillion over a decade, that single policy would consume 71% of all incoming money. He pointed out this leaves only 29% for defense, Social Security, and infrastructure, but added that she also supports the Green New Deal. That proposal costs $93 trillion, bringing her total proposed spending to $125 trillion against a revenue of only $45 trillion. He calculated that she was short by $80 trillion and demonstrated that even confiscating all billionaire wealth would fund the government for only 4 months. He showed that taxing all corporations at 100% would only yield $20 trillion, leaving her still $60 trillion short. Shapiro then shifted to the consequences, noting Medicare for All would eliminate private insurance for 150 million Americans. He discussed her support for defunding the police, noting that in her own district, crime increased by 40% after implementation. He argued her policies literally hurt the minority communities she claims to represent, causing businesses and residents to flee. He attacked her open borders stance, noting that illegal immigration costs $100 billion annually, while she wants to increase that cost. Regarding free college, he argued it is a wealth transfer from working-class taxpayers to relatively privileged students who will earn more. He framed student loan forgiveness as asking a plumber in Ohio to pay for a lawyer's degree in D.C., calling it regressive. Shapiro turned to her in disbelief, stating her policies all share massive costs, zero funding mechanisms, and disastrous outcomes. He concluded her proposals were mathematically impossible fairy tales that would bankrupt the country in a matter of months. Omar tried to argue for ambition, but Shapiro shouted that ambition does not mean ignoring basic arithmetic or making money appear by magic. He stood up, gathering his documents into a pile for a final synthesis of her career, delivered at maximum speed. He summarized the marriage fraud allegations, emphasizing the statistical impossibility of the coincidences and the refusal to take a DNA test. He listed family enrichment, noting the $2.4 million overpayment to her husband was corruption quantified by market rates. He reiterated her anti-Semitism, citing her use of tropes and opposition to defensive systems that protect civilians from terrorists. He continued by listing her foreign loyalty, where she prioritized Somalia over America, and her minimization of the 9/11 attacks. He cited her economic illiteracy, which killed jobs in New York, and proposed spending that exceeded reality by $80 trillion. Shapiro summarized that America gave her safety and opportunity, and she responded with fraud, bigotry, and betrayal of her oath. He looked at the camera, stating facts, do not care about her feelings or identity, and that the data proves she squandered her advantages. The room sat in silence as Shapiro sat down, leaving Omar looking like she had been hit by an intellectual freight train. Within 72 hours, the debate video had accumulated over 150 million views, with 73% of viewers believing Shapiro won decisively. Investigations by the House Ethics Committee and FBI were announced shortly after citing the evidence presented on national television. A primary challenger emerged running on an America First platform, and 6 months later, Omar lost her seat by 23 points. Her career, which was built on identity politics, was washed away by the tide of facts in just 2 hours. Shapiro later commented on his podcast that he didn't end her career, but rather her own conduct did once the facts were exposed.